November 14, 1958, Vienna, Austria. Paul Lockwood hunched his shoulders against the biting wind as he crossed Stephansplatz, the magnificent spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral disappearing into low gray clouds above him. His fingers, chapped from the constant flour and cold, fumbled with his coat buttons. The early morning streets were mostly empty, a few bundled figures hurrying along the cobblestones, breath visible in the frigid air. Paul had made this walk for 3 years now, ever since moving to Vienna to open his bakery. At 34, the former army cook had found his niche in this divided European city, caught between East and West. The simple ritual of baking brought him comfort, the methodical measuring, the transformative heat of the ovens, the satisfaction of feeding people. His small bakery, American Delights, had become popular among expatriates hungry for a taste of home and curious Viennese eager to try his cinnamon rolls and apple pies. The familiar weight of his keys jingled in his pocket as he approached the modest storefront on a narrow side street. Amerikanische Bäckerei read the sign in careful German lettering, with American Delights below it. Paul had insisted on both, believing strongly that integration was respectful. His core belief, hammered into him by his immigrant parents, was that an American abroad represented his country, for better or worse. The bells on the door chimed as he stepped inside, flipping on lights that revealed the gleaming counters, display cases, and the small tables where customers could enjoy coffee with their pastries. Beyond the front lay his sanctuary, the kitchen with its industrial mixers, proofing cabinets, and ovens. Paul started his morning routine, washing his hands thoroughly before putting on his apron. He had been making the dough for his famous cinnamon rolls when the little bell above the door chimed. Wiping flour from his hands, he stepped out front, surprised to have a customer so early. "We're not quite open yet," he called, then stopped short. A man in a tailored gray suit stood examining the display case, his hat still on despite being indoors. Something about his posture, perhaps too casual, too studied, set Paul on edge. "Mr. Lockwood," the man said, not a question. He had an American accent, Midwestern, like Paul's own. "I'm Richard Donnelly. I'd like to speak with you about a matter of national importance." Paul felt a cold that had nothing to do with the November weather. "I'm busy preparing for opening. Perhaps you could come back later." Donnelly smiled thinly. "This won't wait, I'm afraid. I've come from the embassy." Wiping his hands nervously on his apron, Paul led the man to a small table in the corner. Donnelly declined coffee but watched as Paul poured himself a cup with hands that weren't quite steady. "You were Army, correct? 4th Infantry Division, assigned to officer mess duties in Germany before your discharge in '55. "That's right," Paul said cautiously. "But that's all in my past now. I'm just a baker." Donnelly's eyes, a pale blue, assessed him carefully. "Your bakery has become quite popular. I understand the Soviet cultural attaché's wife is particularly fond of your cherry pie." Paul frowned. "I have many customers. I don't keep track of who works where." "But you do notice things, don't you, Mr. Lockwood? People talk in bakeries. They linger. They meet contacts. Vienna is an interesting place these days." The implication hung in the air, and suddenly Paul understood. "You're not from the embassy." "Not exactly." Donnelly placed a business card on the table. It indicated he worked for International Agricultural Development, a cover so thin Paul almost laughed. "CIA?" Paul said flatly. "We need people like you, Mr. Lockwood. People with legitimate reasons to interact with both sides. People who hear things." "I'm not a spy," Paul said, the word feeling ridiculous on his tongue. "No one's asking you to be James Bond," Donnelly replied with a hint of irritation. "Just to observe, report conversations, note who meets whom, perhaps occasionally allow us to use your back room for meetings." Paul stood up abruptly. I'm not interested. Donnelly remained seated. Your sister Nancy in Minneapolis. Her medical bills must be substantial. Leukemia treatment isn't cheap. The blood drained from Paul's face. Leave my family out of this. We could help her. Considerably. And all you need to do is what you already do. Bake bread, serve coffee, and keep your eyes and ears open. That's blackmail, Paul hissed. That's patriotism, Donnelly countered. The Soviets are actively recruiting assets all over Vienna. This city is a chessboard, Mr. Lockwood, and we're losing pieces daily. Paul thought of his sister, of her 2 children, of the mounting hospital bills that his monthly checks barely dented. He thought of his parents who had taught him that being American meant standing up for freedom. But was this freedom being coerced into espionage? I'll think about it, he said finally. Don't think too long, Donnelly replied, standing and adjusting his hat. I'll return tomorrow, same time. And Paul, don't mention this to anyone, for your safety and theirs. After Donnelly left, Paul stood motionless in his empty bakery, the smell of cinnamon suddenly cloying. The simple life he had built was about to become very complicated. True to his word, Donnelly returned the next morning before opening. This time he brought photographs. Paul's sister in a hospital bed, his niece at school, his elderly parents outside their modest home in Illinois. Just to emphasize that we know your pressure points, Donnelly said casually, as though discussing the weather. We also know about Natalie Winters, the Austrian translator Paul had been seeing for 6 months. The daughter of a former Nazi officer who had reinvented himself after the war. Potential vulnerability. Paul agreed that day, a decision that felt both like surrender and like the only possible choice. The changes came gradually. First, a new flour supplier, one who required special storage arrangements for certain deliveries that Paul was not to examine closely. Then, a renovation of the back office to install what Donnelly called improved electrical wiring, but which clearly included surveillance equipment. Paul learned to recognize the faces of certain regulars. Americans who would order coffee, receive a particular pastry on a particular plate, and leave with information hidden in napkins or sugar packets. He learned to spot the Soviet counterparts, the cultural attaché who lingered over tea, the trade representative whose briefcase sometimes switched with another's. By the spring of 1959, American Delights had become what the CIA called a passive collection point, a legitimate business where intelligence could be gathered and occasionally exchanged without arousing suspicion. Paul's role remained mostly that of proprietor, though he began filing weekly reports on his customers, detailing conversations overheard, unusual meetings observed, patterns of behavior that seemed significant. Vienna itself was changing. For years after the Allied occupation had officially ended, the city remained a hotbed of espionage. The Austrian State Treaty of 1955 had established Austrian neutrality, making it one of the few places where East and West could meet openly. The Soviets maintained a large embassy, and the Americans matched them. The UN had established offices there, and everyone, it seemed, needed pastries. Paul's German improved steadily, and with it his ability to understand snippets of conversation. He hired 2 assistants. One, Nina, a cheerful Austrian grandmother whose nephew worked at the Interior Ministry, and the other, Karl, a university student whose father had mysterious business in East Berlin. Both had been vetted by Donnelly's colleagues, though neither knew of Paul's connection to American intelligence. In August, a woman named Nicole Wilson began frequenting the bakery. American, early 30s, with copper hair usually pinned in a practical bun. She claimed to be researching Austrian culinary traditions for a cookbook. She spent hours at the corner table, typing notes on a portable Smith Corona. She's one of ours, Donnelly informed Paul during their monthly meeting in the park near the Belvedere Palace. She'll be handling your day-to-day contact from now on. I'm being reassigned. You're leaving me with a rookie? Paul asked, alarmed. Donnelly laughed. Nicole has been with the agency for 8 years. She was in Budapest during the uprising. She's forgotten more about tradecraft than I'll ever know. The next day, when Nicole came in for her usual apple strudel, Paul placed a napkin under her saucer, his sign that they needed to talk. After the morning rush, when only a couple of students remained engrossed in their books, she approached the counter. Your strudel is authentic, she said casually, but the cinnamon rolls are what bring me back. Family recipe, Paul replied with the agreed-upon response. My grandmother would roll in her grave if I told anyone the secret ingredient. Nicole smiled, the professional warmth never quite reaching her eyes. Perhaps you could show me your kitchen sometime? For my research. 20 minutes later, in the privacy of his back office, Paul learned how things would change under Nicole's supervision. We're shifting from passive to active collection, she explained, her voice low and efficient. Vienna is heating up. The Soviets are bringing in new personnel, and we need to understand why. I'm just a baker, Paul protested, an echo of his initial conversation with Donnelly. You're an asset now, Nicole corrected, and a valuable one. Your bakery serves members of 17 different diplomatic missions. You're going to help us understand what they're planning. The new protocols were more demanding. Paul was given a miniature camera disguised as a cigarette lighter to photograph documents when possible. He was taught simple coding systems for his reports. Most significantly, his back storeroom was modified to create a small meeting space, accessible through a hidden door behind shelving units, where Nicole could debrief sources without entering through the main bakery. By winter, Paul found himself transformed. He observed customers with calculated interest, noting details about their clothing, companions, and conversations. He developed a technique of dropping trays near interesting discussions, lingering to clean up while absorbing information. He learned to spot surveillance, the same nondescript man reading a newspaper across the street, the utility worker who took too long examining the same pole. His relationship with Natalie grew strained. His long hours at the bakery, his distracted manner, his reluctance to discuss his day, all created distance between them. When she suggested meeting his family during an upcoming trip to America, Paul deflected, knowing the agency would never approve such a connection with someone they hadn't fully vetted. You've changed, Natalie told him during a tense dinner in February 1960. You're always watching, always listening, but never present anymore. The business is demanding, Paul replied, the lie sour on his tongue. These political tensions are bad for tourism. I'm worried about staying afloat. The irony wasn't lost on him. His bakery had never been more financially secure, thanks to CIA subsidies disguised as supply deliveries and a steady stream of American personnel who paid premium prices. The agency had also quietly covered his sister's medical treatments, as promised. Yet he felt hollow. His original purpose, creating something authentic and bringing people together through food, corrupted by secrets and surveillance. In March, Nicole brought news that heightened Paul's unease. We have intelligence suggesting a senior KGB officer is operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy, she said during their weekly meeting in the hidden back room. We believe he's coordinating a major operation, possibly involving the placement of a mole within NATO headquarters or the American embassy. What does this have to do with me? Paul asked, though he already suspected the answer. The officer's wife has developed a fondness for your bakery, specifically for your Black Forest cake. She comes every Wednesday at 10:30. Paul remembered her, a stern-faced woman who nonetheless smiled when presented with chocolate and cherries. Madame Petrova. She barely speaks, just points and nods. We want to recruit her, Nicole said bluntly, and you're going to help us. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Paul would begin setting aside special cakes for Madame Petrova, gradually establishing a personal connection. He would mention his sister's illness, creating an opening for sympathy. Eventually, Nicole would engineer a meeting outside the bakery, where the approach would be made, offering financial incentives for information about her husband's activities. If the Soviets discover this recruitment attempt, they'll kill her, Paul said, appalled. And possibly me. If her husband's operation succeeds, American agents throughout Eastern Europe could be compromised, Nicole countered. This is the job, Paul. Sometimes it's messy. For the first time since being drawn into this shadow world, Paul seriously considered refusing. But the machinery was already in motion. The following Wednesday, he presented Madame Petrova with a complimentary slice of cake, in appreciation of her loyal patronage. Her suspicious gaze softened slightly as she accepted the gift. The pressure intensified when Nicole revealed another layer to their operation. "We have reason to believe the KGB may be onto you," she said in early April. "A Czech diplomat who frequents your bakery has been observed meeting with known Soviet intelligence officers. He may be reporting on activities here." "Then shut it down," Paul urged. "Move your operation elsewhere." On the contrary, Nicole replied with a cold smile that reminded Paul that for all her professionalism, she was a trained operative who accepted risks he could not fathom. "We're going to feed him false information. Make the Soviets chase ghosts while we pursue Madame Petrova." The next months became an elaborate dance of deception. Paul provided select customers with subtle misinformation, hinting at non-existent American operations. He cultivated his relationship with Madame Petrova, learning that her name was Anya, that she had a son studying engineering in Moscow, that she despised Vienna's damp winters. As summer approached, Paul's anxiety grew. Each morning, he checked for surveillance before opening his shop. Each evening, he took circuitous routes home, employing the counter-surveillance techniques Nicole had taught him. He began keeping a go-bag packed with emergency supplies and cash in his apartment, ready to flee if necessary. His relationship with Natalie ended painfully in May when she confronted him about his secretiveness. "There's someone else," she accused over dinner at her apartment. "Or something you're not telling me." Unable to explain, Paul let her believe the former. Better she think him unfaithful than know the truth that might endanger her. "You're a coward," she'd said as he left for the last time. And the worst part was that she was right. He was afraid not just of physical danger, but of what he was becoming. The operation against Madame Petrova progressed slowly. By July, she would occasionally linger at the counter, exchanging pleasantries about the weather or commenting on the day's pastry selection. Nicole assured Paul that this was significant progress, that trust was being established. Then came August 5, 1960, the day everything unraveled. Paul arrived at his bakery before dawn as usual, but immediately sensed something was wrong. The lock showed microscopic scratches. The bell above the door didn't chime with its usual tone. In the kitchen, utensils had been rearranged slightly, only noticeable because of his meticulous habits. Someone had searched his bakery overnight. Fighting panic, Paul went through his opening routine while surreptitiously checking for missing items or planted devices. He found nothing obvious but couldn't shake the feeling of violation. When Nina arrived to help with the morning bread, he was tense and distracted. "Are you ill, Mr. Lockwood?" she asked, concerned. "You look pale." "Just didn't sleep well," Paul replied, forcing a smile. The morning customers came and went. The Czech diplomat, Dr. Novak, arrived for his usual coffee and apricot pastry at 9:15. Madame Petrova appeared at her regular time, today with a younger man Paul had never seen before. Tall, blonde, with a coldness in his blue eyes that made Paul's stomach tighten. "My nephew," she explained briefly, though the man's bearing screamed military or intelligence. When Nicole failed to make her usual appearance at 11:30, Paul's unease hardened into certainty. Something was very wrong. At noon, he sent Nina on an errand to purchase more vanilla, needing time alone to think. As soon as she left, Dr. Novak approached the counter, no trace of his usual scholarly diffidence. "Mr. Lockwood," he said quietly, "I believe we should speak privately." The back office felt airless as Paul closed the door behind them. Novak didn't sit, instead moving to the window where he could observe the street. "Your handler has been arrested," he said without preamble. "The woman who poses as a cookbook writer. She was detained last night while meeting with a Soviet source." Paul felt the blood drain from his face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Novak's laugh held no humor. "Please, Mr. Lockwood, we've been watching this bakery for over a year. We know exactly what it is and what you are." "We?" Paul asked, though he already knew. "I represent certain interests in Prague," Novak said delicately. "We have maintained a cooperative relationship with our Soviet comrades, but we have our own intelligence priorities. The Czech intelligence service, working with but separate from the KGB. Somehow, this seemed worse than dealing with the Soviets directly." "What do you want from me?" Paul asked, his mouth dry. "The same thing the Americans wanted. Information, access, occasionally, a place for private conversations." Novak smiled thinly. "Your country has abandoned you, Mr. Lockwood. Your handler will be traded back to the West eventually, but she will never return to Vienna. You, however, remain vulnerable." The implication was clear. Cooperate or be exposed. "I'll need time to consider," Paul said, playing for time he didn't have. "You have until tomorrow morning," Novak replied. "When I return for breakfast, you will give me your answer. If it is not satisfactory, Madame Petrova's nephew, who is actually a counterintelligence officer, will pay you a less pleasant visit." After Novak left, Paul moved on autopilot, serving customers while his mind raced through options. Run? The Soviets would interpret that as confirmation of guilt. Stay and refuse Novak? Face arrest, possibly worse. Agree to work for Czech intelligence? Become a traitor to his country. By closing time, Paul had made his decision. He sent Nina home early, claiming a headache, then methodically cleaned his kitchen for what he knew would be the last time. From beneath a loose floorboard under his office desk, he retrieved the emergency communication kit Nicole had provided, a one-time pad cipher and frequencies for an emergency radio contact. In his apartment that evening, Paul encoded a brief message. Blackbird compromised. Handler captured. Seeking extraction. Using the shortwave radio disguised as a commercial model, he transmitted the message at exactly 8:30 p.m., as he'd been trained, then destroyed the one-time pad. He packed only what he could carry in one suitcase: clothes, his mother's recipe book, the go-bag with cash and false identity papers, and a few photographs from his former life. At 10 p.m., he walked to the designated emergency meeting point, a bench in the Stat Park near the Johann Strauss Monument. For nearly an hour, Paul sat in the growing darkness, watching for surveillance, certain that at any moment Soviet or Czech agents would emerge from the shadows. When a groundskeeper approached, methodically emptying trash bins despite the late hour, Paul tensed, ready to flee. "The ducks are particularly hungry tonight," the man said in German-accented English, delivering the recognition phrase. "They always prefer stale bread," Paul responded, relief weakening his knees. Within minutes, Paul was in the back of a maintenance truck, being driven by a silent American with a military bearing. They traveled to the outskirts of Vienna, where Paul was transferred to the trunk of a diplomatic vehicle. Cramped and nauseated, he endured a 2-hour journey before being allowed out at a safe house near the West German border. For 3 days, Paul remained in the sparsely furnished farmhouse, debriefed extensively by a series of American intelligence officers. He learned that Nicole had indeed been arrested but was expected to be part of a prisoner exchange already being negotiated. His bakery had been under Soviet surveillance for months, with the Czech intelligence service running a parallel operation. The approach by Novak had been authorized at the highest levels in Prague. "What happens to me now?" Paul asked the senior debriefer, a gray-haired man who identified himself only as Thompson. "You can't return to Vienna," Thompson said bluntly. "Your cover is blown. The Soviets would arrest you for espionage, and the Austrian authorities wouldn't protect you. So I go home?" Thompson's hesitation told Paul everything. "There are complications. Your involvement with our operation in Vienna needs to remain classified. Returning to the U.S. would require a comprehensive cover story that might not withstand scrutiny." "You're saying I can't go home?" Paul felt a wave of vertigo, as though the ground beneath him had suddenly vanished. "Not immediately," Thompson clarified. "We're proposing relocation to another European posting, perhaps Rome or Athens, somewhere you can establish a new identity, a new business. In time, perhaps a few years, when diplomatic sensitivities have eased, repatriation might be possible." Exile. That's what Thompson was describing, though he couched it in bureaucratic language. The country Paul had agreed to serve, had compromised his values to serve, was now abandoning him. "And if I refuse? If I just want to go home now?" Thompson's expression hardened slightly. "That would be inadvisable. Without our protection, you would be vulnerable. The Soviets have a long reach, and there would be questions about your activities in Vienna that could prove embarrassing for certain parties." More blackmail, Paul thought bitterly. This time from his own side. 2 weeks later, Paul Lockwood ceased to exist. In his place emerged Peter Larson, an American baker with a new passport, new background documents, and a small cafe in a residential neighborhood of Rome. His hair had been darkened, his distinctive mustache shaved off. He spoke with a carefully cultivated Midwestern accent different from his natural speech patterns. For 3 years, Paul, now Peter, ran his modest Italian cafe, maintaining minimal contact with his CIA handlers through innocuous coded letters to a post office box. He was allowed to write to his family, though his letters were vetted to ensure they contained no hint of his true circumstances. He told them he had fallen in love with Italy after a vacation and decided to start over, promising to visit when his business was more established. His sister recovered from leukemia, thanks to treatments the CIA had indeed paid for, as promised. His parents expressed disappointment at his sudden move, but supported his apparent quest for happiness. They never knew that their son had become a ghost, living in the shadows of a covert world he had never sought to enter. In September 1963, as the Cold War continued its dangerous dance between détente and disaster, Paul received an unexpected visitor at his cafe. A young American diplomat introduced himself as James Curtis from the State Department, ordered an espresso, and passed Paul a folded newspaper. Inside was a brief note: "Exfiltration approved. September 30th, Rome Airport. Passport enclosed." After 3 years in exile, Paul was being allowed to come home. The flight from Rome to New York carried a mixture of businessmen, tourists, and a quiet American with newly restored reddish-brown hair and a carefully regrown mustache. Paul Lockwood had re-emerged, his Peter Larson identity abandoned in a trash bin at Leonardo da Vinci Airport. As the plane descended toward Idlewild Airport, Paul gazed out at the sprawling American landscape with a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at returning home, anger at the years stolen from him, fear that his former life in intelligence might still shadow him. Most of all, he felt a profound weariness. The weight of secrets, the constant vigilance, the moral compromises, they had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. the idealistic baker who had opened a shop in Vienna believing he could build bridges through something as simple as bread was gone, replaced by a man who instinctively checked for surveillance, who noticed patterns in crowds, who never quite trusted appearances. In the terminal, Paul was met by a nondescript man in a gray suit who guided him through customs with remarkable efficiency. They rode in silence to a hotel in Manhattan, where Paul was ushered into a suite on the 12th floor. There, to his surprise, sat the gray-haired Thompson from the safe house years earlier, now looking considerably older. "Welcome home, Mr. Lockwood," Thompson said, offering his hand. "You've been officially cleared for repatriation. Your new identity papers are in order. We've arranged a position for you at a bakery in Chicago, should you choose to accept it. Or you're free to make your own way, with certain restrictions." Those restrictions, Paul learned, included never discussing his work in Vienna, maintaining regular check-ins with a CIA contact, and accepting that certain parts of Europe would remain off-limits to him indefinitely. "Is it ever really over?" Paul asked as Thompson prepared to leave. "This life?" The older man paused at the door, his expression softening slightly. "The work ends, Mr. Lockwood. The silence doesn't. That's the price we all pay." By the winter of 1963, Paul had established himself in Chicago, running a small but successful bakery in a neighborhood with a large immigrant population. His European experience gave his breads and pastries an authenticity that attracted customers. His friendly but slightly reserved demeanor discouraged too many personal questions. He reconnected with his family, offering vague explanations about his years abroad that they accepted without pressing. His sister, healthy again, introduced him to friends, trying to restart his social life. His parents, now in their 70s, were simply grateful to have him within driving distance. Occasionally, a man named Phillips would stop by the bakery, ostensibly to purchase bread but really to check that Paul maintained his silence, and to verify that no suspicious characters had taken an interest in the former CIA asset. These visits grew less frequent as the years passed. Paul never returned to Vienna. He read news of détente, of arms negotiations, of the slow thaw in Cold War tensions with a particular perspective few could understand. He sometimes wondered about Nicole, about Novak, about Madame Petrova and her cold-eyed nephew. He wondered if his small role in their vast geopolitical chess game had mattered at all. In 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War officially ended, Paul received a small package at his bakery. Inside was a book of Viennese pastry recipes, with a handwritten note on the title page. "Some secrets are best kept, but recipes should be shared. The game is finally over." And no return address, no further explanation. Paul placed the book on his shelf and returned to his ovens, to the simple, honest work of baking bread in a world that suddenly had one less wall dividing it.